There are things you read twice. The integration document was one of them. I found it on the third night, buried 4 layers deep in the compact medical liaison protocols. A subsection nobody had flagged because nobody had needed it in 61 years. The file was titled Velorveth Biological Compatibility, Integration Events and Medico-Legal Obligations. 47 pages. I read all of them that first night, and then I read them again the following night, with the border post's heating coil ticking in the corner and the ridge wind pushing against the shelter panels outside, and a cup of ground seed concentrate going cold at my elbow. By the time I set the file down the second time, I already knew what I was going to do. I am not a man who makes decisions quickly. I spent 22 years as a field medic on the compact's outer margin frontier, and what you learn in that work, the thing they cannot teach in a training bay, the thing that only comes from enough time in enough situations where the wrong call cannot be taken back, is that the decision you make fast is usually the one you regret. You slow down. You read the whole form. You check the instrument twice before you use it. The medics who moved too quickly were the ones who ended careers or ended lives, and I had watched both happen enough times across 22 years to build a different habit entirely. So I read the document twice. I sat with it. I let it be what it was without rushing toward a conclusion. And on the 4th morning, before the ridge turned amber with the local sun, I had my answer. But I am getting ahead of myself. She arrived at the border post on a Tuesday, which I know because I was updating the weekly supply notation when the outer shelter door cycled open, and 2 Velorveth border officers came through carrying a third figure between them. I registered the officer's armor first, the deep blue-gray of Velorveth frontier security, worn in the way armor gets worn after real use rather than ceremony, the finish dulled at the joints, and the rank markings showing honest wear. Then I registered the figure they were carrying. She was not in armor. She wore a long outer wrap in dark gray transit cloth, and it was soaked through on the left side from a laceration that had been field-dressed with something that was already failing. She was conscious, which told me she was stubborn, because the wound was the kind that generally argues against consciousness. One of the officers said something in Velorveth standard that I caught most of. She would not let us take her to the main medical station. And then the other officer looked at me with the expression of someone who has been overruled by someone considerably more important than themselves, and is relieved to have the problem become someone else's. I am a medical liaison at a border post. I have a treatment room, an observation corridor, a supply cabinet that I know the contents of in exact detail, and 12 years of outer margin field experience on top of the 22 before that. I do not have a full surgical suite or a Velorveth certified trauma physician or a team of anyone at all most days. What I have is the habit of working with what is present rather than mourning what is absent. It is not an exciting habit. It is a useful one. I said, "Let me look at the wound." She let me look at the wound. Her name, I would learn over the following hours, was Ithari Velsorn. She was the ruling queen of the Kethorveth sovereignty, one of the 7 major Velorveth sovereign houses, with territorial reach across 2 frontier sectors and formal diplomatic standing, with the compact going back 4 generations. She was 34 years old, 9 years into her reign, and she had been traveling in transit designation, traveling incognito, in plain civilian wrap, without the court apparatus that normally accompanied a sovereign of her standing. When something had gone wrong at the border crossing that I did not ask about, and she did not volunteer. What she was, at the moment I met her, was a patient with a deep lateral laceration on her left side, a field dressing that had stopped performing its function approximately 90 minutes ago, and a composure that I found, in the clinical portion of my assessment, both impressive and slightly alarming. The kind of composure that is not performed. The kind that has been built, layer by layer, across years of situations where showing something would have been a liability. You see it in experienced soldiers, and in people who have held positions of authority for long enough that the authority has stopped being new. The injury needed proper irrigation, correct tension suturing with the right gauge instruments for velour tissue, and careful monitoring against the species-specific complication risks I had on file from the liaison protocol documentation. The velour physiology files were thorough. Whoever had written them had expected medical liaisons to actually be called upon to use them, which was not always the assumption behind that kind of documentation. I had read them when I arrived at the posting 12 years ago, and I had updated my notes each time a revised edition was filed. It was a useful habit that was now more directly useful than it had been in some time. I said, "This is going to take a while." She said, "I expected that." Her voice was low, even. Not the register of someone performing composure, the register of someone for whom composure had been the baseline condition for a long time, and who had stopped noticing it as an effort. I noted it the way you note calibration variance in an instrument. Not urgently, but accurately, filed in the place where observations go until they become relevant. The two officers confirmed she was stable and left. I did not ask them to stay. I did not ask why she had refused the main medical station, which had more resources than my border post and a velour-certified physician on rotating staff. It was not relevant to the treatment. What was relevant was the instrument tray, the correct suture weight, and the kind of focused attention that a lateral laceration with vascular involvement demands, and that I had given to dozens of injuries across 34 years of medical work in difficult conditions. I gave it to this one as well. She stayed 3 days. The first day was purely medical. I checked the wound at 4-hour intervals, managed the early inflammatory response, adjusted the dressing twice when the drainage characteristics changed. She was a cooperative patient, answered my clinical questions directly, reported symptoms accurately, did not understate discomfort the way some patients do when they believe that reporting pain is a form of weakness. A patient who tells you the truth about what they are feeling makes your job substantially easier. I made a note of it. It was the kind of detail that tells you something about a person that has nothing to do with their title. On the first evening, I brought her a tray from the Commons. The border post maintained a basic provision rotation, nothing elaborate, but adequate for the frontier posting, and set it on the side table by the examination surface. She looked at it for a moment. The look was not suspicion exactly, but it carried the assessment quality of someone who was deciding what the gesture meant. She said, "You did not have to do that." I said, "The tray is there when you want it. No obligation attached." She ate. Not everything on it, but enough that I updated the intake notation with a reasonable figure. I did not comment on what she ate or how much, or whether she should have more. It was not my concern to manage her food intake beyond confirming that she was taking adequate nutrition during tissue repair, and the tray addressed that. What she chose to do with it after that was her own decision. The second day she was noticeably stronger. I had expected that velour tissue repair rates at this stage of recovery were documented in the protocol file, and she was tracking correctly. She moved to the chair by the observation corridor window for several hours in the morning, watching the ridge. The Kethorveth border region runs along a basalt escarpment, a long shelf of dark stone rising above a lowland agricultural basin, with the sovereignty's territory on the far side and the compact's outer margin posting on this side. In the morning, the ridge catches the light in a particular way. The stone is dark basalt, which should absorb rather than reflect, but there is something in the mineral composition that produces a quality of warmth, orange turning copper turning amber as the local sun moves, and it is a thing worth watching if you have not seen it before. I had watched it for 12 years and still found it worth watching. She watched it for a long time without speaking. I did not interrupt. It was her time and she could spend it as she chose. and I had documentation to maintain and supplies to inventory and the ordinary work of a border posting that continues regardless of who is sitting in the corridor chair. In the afternoon, I changed the dressing again. The wound was responding correctly, no secondary infection indicators, vascular involvement stabilizing according to the predicted curve, tissue repair beginning at the rate the Velorvath physiology file anticipated for a patient of her age and condition. I told her this. She listened with the precise attention of someone who wants accurate information and is accustomed to receiving it in direct form rather than managed form. Then she asked a question about the suture tension that told me she had read something about Velorvath wound management, enough to formulate an informed question, not enough to answer it without assistance. I explained the tension calibration and why I had chosen the gauge I used. She nodded once, considered what I had said, asked a follow-up question that was slightly more technical, and then apparently satisfied herself that the suture work was correct and moved on. It was in the late afternoon of the second day that I noticed the residue on the edge of the examination surface. A faint luminous trace, pale blue-white, the kind of mark that Velorvath physiology texts describe as Velkeith byproduct. Biological compound, produced by certain Velorvath sovereign lines during accelerated tissue repair, as a natural byproduct of the elevated healing cascade. It is not common across the general Velorvath population. The texts I had studied noted its presence in perhaps 3% of individuals, and almost exclusively in primary line sovereignty carriers, those with unbroken descent from the original founding houses. I photographed it and made a notation, careful and thorough. Then I did what I have always done with anything I do not fully understand. I located the source material and began reading. The medical literature on Velkeith is extensive in the Velorvath academic and clinical records. In the compact liaison protocols it is very nearly absent. A single subsection, 47 pages, filed under a category that implied it was unlikely to be needed. I read it all that evening, after she had settled for the night, the border post quiet around me, and the ridge dark outside the corridor window, and the heating coil producing its periodic tick that I had long since stopped hearing consciously. The Velkeith compound, in its concentrated form, is a biological integrant. That word, integrant, carries a specific meaning in the Velorvath medical literature, distinct from augment or modifier or any of the other terms that frontier medical texts tend to use for compounds that interact with human biology. An integrant does not add something external. It does not suppress or enhance a specific function. What it does is more precise and more total. It integrates the drinker's biology with the sovereign carrier's Velkeith genetic framework at a fundamental level. The drinker's physiology after integration is no longer baseline human. It is not Velorvath either. It becomes a third category, documented across 61 years of integration events, stable, viable, and well characterized in the medical record. And permanent. The document was unambiguous on this point, and I appreciated the unambiguity. Permanent means what it says. There is no reversal process. One formal reversal attempt appeared in the case study record, logged with the outcome notation unsuccessful, and a subsequent 60-page analysis of why the attempt had failed at the biochemical level. The integration, once established, does not undo. I read Appendix C, the documented physiological changes, with care. Some were minor, metabolic rate adjustments, sensory threshold shifts of the kind that fell within normal human variation at their outer edges. Some were significant, enhanced cellular repair rate, altered hormonal baseline, a documented extension of the expected lifespan for integrated individuals versus baseline human controls, tracked across the 61-year record. None of the changes were cosmetic in the frivolous sense. All of them were real and specific, and would affect the life of anyone who underwent the integration. I set the document down around midnight, looked at the observation corridor window. The ridge was invisible in the dark, just the faint light scatter from the lowland settlements beyond the escarpment's far edge, amber gold reflecting against nothing you could see directly. I sat with what I had read for some time, not deciding yet, just sitting with it the way you sit with a diagnostic reading before you act on it, letting the information be what it is, not rushing toward a conclusion the evidence has not yet fully supported. Then I slept, because rest is part of good decision-making, and I had learned that as thoroughly as I had learned everything else. I requested the Velorvath version of the document the following morning. She was at the corridor window already when I came through. She was consistently awake before me, which suggested she either required less sleep than I did or had been carrying something that made sleep difficult, and both were plausible given her situation. The ridge outside was at its first stage, the very early gray before the orange arrived, the basalt still dark and the air above it holding a slight atmospheric shimmer from the overnight temperature differential. I said, the compact integration protocol document references a more complete Velorvath source text. I would like to read that version. She turned from the window. She looked at me for a moment, with the careful reading quality she brought to everything that presented her with data she had not expected. She said, "You have read the compact version." It was not a question. I said, "Yes, last night." She said, "All 47 pages." I said, "All 47 pages and the appendices." She was quiet for a few seconds. Then she said, "The Velorvath document is considerably longer. It has supplementary case studies that the compact version does not include." I said, "I would appreciate access to those as well." She did not answer immediately. She was still reading me. That careful, precise reading that I had begun to understand was not suspicion, but rather the quality of attention a person develops when they have spent years in a position where the wrong read of a situation has consequences. A kind of accuracy she had been trained into by the weight of her role. She said, "What you are describing is not a small thing, Rael." She had not used my name before that morning. I registered it. I said, "I know. I would like to read the full document before I make any decision. That is how I do things." She said, "Most people who read the summary do not proceed to the full text." I said, "I have noticed that tendency. I do not share it." She looked at me for a moment more. Then she reached into the transit wrap's inner pocket, the left side, where she kept the items she accessed regularly, and produced a compact data card, pale gray, the standard Velorvath archival format. She held it out. She said, "The integration section begins on page 12. The supplementary case studies form a separate volume on the same card." I took it. I said, "I will read it tonight." She said, and her voice was entirely level when she said it, the same level register she had maintained across 3 days of clinical assessments and tray arrivals and ridge watching. "One sip. That is all the integration requires. But I want you to hear this clearly before you read a single further page. Once you have taken it, there is no return to what you were. Your biology will be changed, and it will remain changed. I am not stating this as a caution against proceeding. I am stating it because precision matters and you deserve the precise version." I said, "I understand." She said, "Most people, when they understand, do not read further." I said, "I am not most people." She looked at me for another moment. The ridge outside had begun its first shift toward orange, the very earliest color bleeding into the gray sky above the basalt. She turned back to it. She said, "No, I do not think you are." I read the Velorvath document that evening, from the point I reached when I sat down after the post's last round of daily checks, through most of the night. The document was, as she had said, considerably longer than the compact version, 112 pages in the main text, with the supplementary case studies comprising another 60. I read them all. I read the mechanism sections with the care I would give to any clinical procedure I had not performed before. I read Appendix C 3 times, because the subject matter warranted 3 readings. The first to understand the scope of the changes, the second to understand the mechanisms behind them, the third to sit with the full picture of what a lifetime of integration would be. The document was written well. This is not a small thing to say about a technical text on a subject of this sensitivity. Whoever had authored the Velorveth integration documentation had made a deliberate choice to write for the reader rather than against them, to give the full information without editorializing the conclusion, to trust the reader with the complete facts, and the understanding that those facts were sufficient for an informed decision. The compact version's authors had made the same choice, to their credit. Neither document told you what to do. They told you what was true. The decision was yours. I sat with the completed document until approximately 2 in the morning. The heating coil ticked. The ridge outside was fully dark. My concentrate cup had gone cold twice, and I had reheated it twice, which is not how I prefer to drink it but was appropriate to the circumstances. I was not using the cup for the concentrate. I was using it for something to hold while I sat with what I had read. What I had read was this: the integration was real, substantial, permanent, and well documented. The changes in Appendix C were not trivial. A person who chose the integration was choosing to become something different from what they had been, in ways that would be present for the rest of their life. And none of it changed what I already knew, which was not something the document had given me. The document had given me the pharmacology and the physiology and the case studies. What I already knew, I had learned across 4 days of bringing trays and changing dressings, and watching the way she asked about suture tension, carefully, wanting to understand the mechanism rather than simply the outcome. What I already knew, I had learned from 3 seconds of silence before she said you have already read the compact version, and from the fact that she had told me about the compound without being asked, on the morning of the 3rd day, because she had decided I deserved to know. The Velkeith was a consequence, not a cause. I set the data card down at 2 in the morning, wrote 3 lines of notes in my personal log about the document's supplementary case study methodology, and then went to sleep. She was at the corridor window when I came through at 6 the next morning. The ridge was turning amber copper outside, the first real color of the day moving up the basalt face from the base, where the stone was still dark, to the upper ridge, where the direct sun was catching it and pulling the warmth out of the mineral. I had watched this particular sequence for 12 years, and it remained the most consistently satisfying thing about the posting. She was watching it too. She had her hands loose at her sides, which was unusual. She generally held something during the morning window watching, a cup or the transit wrap's lapel edge or the corridor railing. Her hands were just at her sides, open. I went to the supply cabinet and found the small specimen flask I had located in my mind the previous evening when I had understood what I was going to do. I set it on the treatment room surface. Then I filled the kettle and made 2 cups of concentrate, because it was cold and early and she had not yet had anything that morning, and brought them both through to the corridor. She took the cup without looking at me. She said, still watching the ridge, "You read all of it." I said, "Yes." She said, "And?" I said, "I would like to collect a sample." She turned then. The movement was not fast, nothing about her was fast. She moved with the same deliberateness she brought to everything, but it was complete. She looked at me directly. Her eyes in the morning corridor light were pale silver, luminous at the angle where the early ridge amber came through the observation panel, and they were doing the careful reading that I had come to understand was not suspicion but attention. She said, "Rail, I told you I was not asking you for this." I said, "I know." She said, "You understand what it is. You understand what it costs." I said, "I read Appendix C 3 times." She said, "The changes are not reversible." I said, "I am aware." She said, "You read the case study in Section 7, the reversal attempt." I said, "I read the subsequent 60-page analysis of why it failed." She set her cup down on the corridor ledge. She looked at me with the full weight of the careful attention she had been bringing to things throughout the 4 days I had known her, and for the first time since she had arrived at my treatment room door, it was not a clinical reading. It was the kind of attention a person gives something they are trying to understand but do not yet have a frame for. She said, "Why?" Not a challenge, a genuine question. The question of someone who has spent 9 years in a position where people act near her for reasons that are generally comprehensible and self-interested, and who has learned to ask directly when something does not fit that shape. I said, "I have been a medical liaison at this border post for 7 years. Before that, I was a field medic for 22 years on the outer margin frontier. I have worked alone for most of my professional life, not all of it, but most, and I have been genuinely content with that arrangement. I read everything before I sign it. I do not make decisions quickly. I am not in the habit of doing things that are primarily about me." The ridge outside had advanced from amber to the full copper stage, the wide band of warm color running across the middle third of the basalt face. I knew this sequence. Copper would hold for about 40 minutes and then begin cooling toward the bronze of late morning. I said, "You told me the truth about what you carry. You told me on the morning of the 3rd day, without being asked, because you had decided I deserved accurate information. You answered every clinical question I put to you without managing your answers toward a conclusion you preferred. You asked about the suture tension because you had read enough to ask an informed question, and when I explained the mechanism, you asked a follow-up question that told me you were trying to understand it rather than simply confirm that I had done it correctly. You ate what was on the tray. You watched the ridge in the morning without explaining why." She was very still. The cup was on the ledge behind her. Her hands were at her sides again. I said, "I have worked beside people for 34 years. Medics, soldiers, supply officers, diplomatic liaisons, frontier contractors, everyone who passes through an outer margin posting. And I can tell you that what you showed me in 4 days is more than most people show in considerably longer. You are honest and precise, and you read things carefully before you trust them. And you are alone in a way that people in your position are almost always alone, because everyone around you is there because of what you are rather than who you are. And I find, upon consideration, that I am not willing to be an exception to that pattern by going somewhere else." I picked up the specimen flask from the treatment room surface and held it. I said, "I am not doing this because of the integration. I am doing this because the integration is what makes staying possible, and staying is what I have decided to do." She looked at the flask. She looked at me. Her expression was not wet. She was not that kind of person, or not in that moment, but something in it had shifted in a way that I did not have precise clinical terminology for. Something had gone out of it that had been present throughout the previous 4 days. A quality of managed distance, the professional composure that a ruling sovereign carries not because she feels nothing, but because she has learned, through years of occasions where showing something was a liability, not to show things. She said, "1 sip. You understand that 1 sip is all it requires, and there is no return." I said, "I understand." She said, "You are not frightened." I said, "No." She said, "You have read the document twice and you have decided, and you are not frightened." I said, "I read everything I could find that was relevant to this decision. I sat with it across 2 nights. I am satisfied with what I know. Fear does not generally improve the quality of decisions made in its presence." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the copper was at its peak, the ridge face holding all the warmth the morning had given it before the cooling began. She said, very quietly, "I have been carrying this compound for 9 years of sovereign status. In those 9 years, the integration window has opened 4 times during healing events. In those 4 times, no one has ever." She stopped. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to finish it because I already had the rest of it from the document, which was thorough on the point. In the 61 years of integration records, every known integration event had occurred without advance awareness on the part of the drinker. The integration had happened accidentally, in every documented case, or under duress, or as a forced act with no genuine informed consent. There was no case in the medical record of a person who had read the full document, understood the permanent nature of the integration, waited the appropriate time to be certain of their decision, and then chosen it deliberately. I was about to be the first entry of that kind in the 61 years of record. I said, "I know." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she set her hand, the left hand, the healing side, against the inside of her own wrist, where the Velkeith compound comes through cleanest in the late integration window. The trace it left on the flask when she tilted her wrist was pale blue-white, faintly luminous even in the morning corridor's ordinary overhead light. She held the flask out. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Do not thank me yet." I said, "All right." I drank it. The initial physical response matched Appendix B's description with reasonable accuracy. Warmth, moving from the center outward. A quality of pressure that was not painful, but occupied a significant portion of my attention for approximately the first 30 minutes. The way a structural change in a building's foundation occupies the attention of anyone inside without being loud about it. Then, across the following 3.5 hours, a sustained process of something I can only describe as adjustment. My own biology doing something I could observe but not direct, like watching a calibration proceed on a system I maintain but cannot override during the calibration itself. I sat in the chair by the treatment room and let it proceed. I had done what I could to prepare, which was reading everything that was available and arriving at the integration in an informed state, and now the preparation was complete and the process was simply what it was. I was not anxious about it. Anxiety is a useful signal when it is indicating that you have not yet gathered the information you need to make a decision. I had gathered the information. Anxiety no longer had a function. Ithari sat in the adjacent chair. She had not left. Around hour 2, I said, "You do not need to stay. The document was clear that the initial integration response does not require attendance." She said, "The document was written for cases in which the integration happened accidentally." I said, "The mechanism is the same regardless." She said, "I am aware." She stayed. I did not argue the point further because she had chosen to stay and the choice was hers. Around hour 3, she said, "How does it feel?" I said, "Like reading a very long document and reaching the final page and understanding, for the first time, what all the preceding pages were building toward." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is not how the case studies describe it." I said, "The case studies were written by people who had not chosen the integration. The experience of being integrated involuntarily and the experience of choosing the integration with complete information are not the same experience. They share a mechanism. The phenomenology is different." She said, "You have already begun analyzing it." I said, "Old habit." She said, and I was not certain I was meant to hear it, "Yes, it is." We sat through the 4th hour together. The heating coil ticked. The ridge outside the corridor window moved through its stages, amber morning, broadening copper, the early cooling toward the flat white of midday that preceded the afternoon's return of warmth. I watched my own hands periodically, because they were there, and the documentation in Appendix C noted that the hands were among the first areas where the subtle early changes in cellular repair rate became apparent over subsequent weeks. They looked the same. They would look the same for some time. Changes of this kind do not announce themselves dramatically. At hour 4, the pressure resolved. It did not end abruptly. It diminished gradually over approximately 40 minutes, the way a strong atmospheric system moves through and the pressure normalizes as it passes. What remained when the process was complete was what the document called integration baseline, the new normal, the physiological state from which all subsequent measurements would be taken. Not painful, not alarming. Simply different from the baseline that had been present before, in the specific ways that Appendix C had described. I said, I believe it is complete. Ithari said, yes. She had been watching me, not constantly, but with the periodic attention of a physician monitoring a process, which was appropriate and which I did not mind. She had the information to assess the integration's progress more accurately than I did. She had been producing the compound for 9 years and presumably had some understanding of what a complete integration looked like from the outside. I said, I will record the baseline measurements this afternoon. The compact liaison protocols require a medical documentation record for integration events. I will file one. She said, you're going to document this immediately. I said, I document everything. The record should be accurate and it should be current. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied the territory between surprise and something warmer. I had not heard it from her before. It was brief, controlled, the sound of a person who is accustomed to managing their reactions, but who has encountered something their management did not fully anticipate. We went to the corridor window in the late afternoon. The ridge was at its third stage, the bronze copper cooling toward the deeper amber gray of early evening, the warmth still in the stone but the quality of light changing, becoming more oblique, the shadows lengthening on the basalt face. I had a cup of concentrate. She had nothing in her hands, which was, as I had noted, unusual for her. Her hands were loose at her sides again, the same way they had been in the morning before she had tilted the Velkeith into the flask. I filed that too, in the place where accurate observations go. She said the court faction will have questions, Velthar Orvath in particular. I said I expect they will. She said, his argument will be that the integration represents a contamination concern, that an integrated human in a medical liaison position compromises the sovereignty's biological boundary protocols. I said, the Velorveth integration document is explicit that the compound's transfer is unidirectional. The carrier's own biological framework is not altered by an integration event. Velthar Orvath's contamination framing does not have evidentiary support in the medical record. She said, he will argue it regardless. I said, then I will prepare the documentation that addresses it before he files. It is better to have the accurate record in place prior to a challenge than to construct it in response to one. The document is clear. The record of 61 years of integration events supports the unidirectionality argument completely. A properly prepared filing would make his challenge difficult to sustain. She was quiet for a moment. The bronze on the ridge was deepening, the last warmth settling into the lower register of color before the light went flat. She said, you are already planning the counter-documentation. I said, I began thinking about it during hour 2 of the integration response. I had enough attention available. She said, during the integration. I said, there was not much else to do during hours 2 and 3. The process was proceeding correctly, and I had already read everything relevant. She made the sound again, slightly longer this time, the same controlled near laugh, and this time something in it was warmer than it had been before. I noted the difference with the same care I gave all accurate observations. She said, I have been a ruling sovereign for 9 years. In that time I have had access to advisors, counselors, court administrative staff, a diplomatic apparatus, frontier liaison personnel, and a governance structure with several hundred active participants at any given moment. Not all of them competent, but many of them in their particular domain, genuinely skilled. I said, that sounds consistent with a sovereignty of this scale. She said, in 9 years of healing events, the Velkeith window has opened 4 times. In 4 openings, across 9 years, in proximity to people with varying degrees of understanding of what the compound was, no one has ever read the full document. No one has ever asked for the Velorvath version. No one has ever asked me for a specimen flask the morning after reading the complete integration record. I said, the summary document is inadequate for informed consent. The full record is the only appropriate basis for a decision of this permanence. She said, yes, it is. She turned from the ridge window and looked at me. The late afternoon light came through the observation panel at a low angle, reaching her face from below and to the left, and in that light her eyes were not the flat silver of the morning corridor. They were deeper, the silver carrying a quality of warmth from the reflected ridge amber, something in them that did not read in overhead light but came through clearly in the oblique. The document had not covered this. There are things that documents do not cover. She said, I am going to name you in the sovereignty record as the first documented voluntary integration event human liaison in Velorvath border history. It is a formal record entry. It cannot be contested by Velthar Orvath or any other court faction member once it is filed. I said, I understand. I will prepare the corresponding compact medical record to file simultaneously, so the two records are consistent and cross-referenced from the point of original filing. She said, I am also going to petition the Compact Liaison Authority to extend your border post assignment. 3 years, minimum, on the grounds that an integrated human medical liaison represents a significant and unrepeatable resource in the border region, with competencies that cannot be replicated by rotating a standard liaison through the position. I said, the case studies suggest that the integration-related competency development reaches its full expression at approximately 24 months. 3 years is a reasonable minimum for the extension justification. I would suggest we include the developmental timeline documentation from the case studies as a supporting appendix to the petition. She said I was going to suggest the same thing. I said, the 61-year record makes a strong argument on its own. The petition should not need to work very hard. She said, no, it should not. She looked at me for a long moment. Outside, the ridge was moving from amber gray toward the first thin blue of early dusk, the basalt cooling, the warmth it had held all day releasing gradually. 15 minutes of this, in my experience of 12 years watching it, and then the deep blue would come in. And then, if the cloud cover was right, which tonight it might be, the settlement lights on the lowland side would catch the ridge face in a reflected amber gold that was different from the direct sun morning amber but no less worth watching. She said, I will be at this border region for an additional 3 months while the court resolves several sovereignty matters that require my direct presence nearby. I said I will be here. She said, and after 3 months my schedule becomes less predictable. I said, I have the integration document, the Velorvath Sovereignty Records Protocols, the Compact Liaison Charter, and 34 years of experience working in conditions where predictability was a courtesy rather than a guarantee. I am not reliant on predictability. She said, you have all of the documents. I said, I read everything. She said after a pause, rail. I said, yes. She said, you drank a compound that will change your biology permanently so that you could stay at a border post, so that you could remain in proximity to someone you have known for 4 days. I said, I sat with it across 2 nights, read all available source material in both the Compact and Velorvath versions, and confirmed that I had adequate information to make the decision. I am satisfied that I did. She said, you are not concerned. I said, I am the same person I was before the integration, making the decision I made because of what I learned across 4 days, which stands on its own regardless of what Appendix C says about my cellular repair rate going forward. She was quiet for a moment. The first deep blue was beginning at the far edge of the sky above the ridge. She said, the Vel Keith, what does it feel like now at baseline with the integration complete? I said, like something that was already true has been written into the record. She did not respond immediately. I heard her exhale, a long, quiet breath that was not tiredness but the sound of something being set down that had been carried for some time, not consciously carried. The kind of weight you do not notice you have been holding until you are no longer holding it. She said quietly, "Yes, that is exactly what it is." The settlement lights came up on the lowland side. The ridge went from deep blue to the reflected amber gold I had predicted, warm, indirect, different in quality from the morning direct light, but with its own particular truth to it, the truth of something seen clearly not because the angle is ideal, but because the light has traveled far enough to show it fairly. We stood at the corridor window until the settlement lights reached their steady state, and the ridge settled into the particular deep, amber gold that I had come to think of, across 12 years, as the most honest version of what it looked like. Then I went to the commons to set out the evening tray. It was that time, and some things do not change, and the ones that do not change are often the ones that matter most. She followed me to the commons table without being asked. She sat across from me. She ate everything on the tray, this time, every item, without remainder, and when she was done, she folded her hands on the table with the particular settled quality of a person who has arrived somewhere they had not expected to arrive, and who finds, against their prior expectation, that it is sufficient. I updated the intake notation with a figure. Then I started on the counter-documentation for Velthar Orvath's eventual filing, because the record should be accurate and it should be current, and I had work to do. She asked if I wanted company while I worked. I said yes. She stayed. The Velthar Orvath filing arrived 12 days later, which was faster than I had expected. It was thorough, I will give him that. He had found precedent language in the sovereignty's boundary protection statutes that was genuinely relevant, even if it did not ultimately support his conclusion, and the filing itself was structured competently. A court faction leader who had held the position for 11 years, according to the sovereignty's public record, builds some professional capability even when the cause he is advancing is wrong. I had the counter-documentation ready. It had been ready for 8 days by the time the filing arrived, because I had started it the evening of the integration, and had refined it across the following week with input from the integration document, the 61-year case study record, and the Vel-Orvath legal framework's own biological compatibility statutes. When I showed it to Ithari, she read it in full, and then read it again, and then said, with the controlled near laugh that I had been filing more instances of across the 12 days. Velthar Orvath has never in his career encountered someone who had already finished the counter-argument before he filed the initial argument. I said, it seemed the efficient approach. She said, most people find efficiency in this kind of institutional conflict by waiting to see what the other side says before responding. I said, that approach gives the other side the advantage of framing. I prefer to have the accurate record established before any framing becomes necessary. She looked at the documentation for another moment and then said, not to me specifically, but not away from me either. You are going to be very difficult for the court to manage. I said, I expect they will adapt. She said, yes, I expect they will. The filing was resolved within 3 weeks, the counter-documentation doing precisely what it was designed to do. Velthar Orvath's contamination argument did not survive contact with the biological compatibility statutes when those statutes were cited precisely and in full. He withdrew the filing. He did not concede the underlying position. 11-year court faction leaders rarely concede the underlying position, but he withdrew the filing, and the record was correct, and that was the part that mattered. Ithari told me about the withdrawal in the corridor, on a morning when the ridge was at its second stage, the copper wide and warm across the basalt face. She said it simply, without emphasis, as she gave me all information, The filing has been withdrawn. I said, good. The supplementary case study documentation should be archived in the sovereignty record as an exhibit, even after the withdrawal. It may be needed again. She said, I have already filed it. I said, good. She was looking at the ridge. I was looking at the ridge. The copper was at its peak, the warmth of it something you could almost feel through the observation panel glass, even though the panel was insulated. She said, you are not going to tell me you told you so. I said, the documentation told you so. I just wrote it down. She made the sound. It lasted longer this time, and there was nothing controlled about it. It was, for the first time in 14 days of knowing her, entirely unmanaged. I noted it. I noted it carefully and completely, and I did not skip a single detail of it. And then I turned back to the ridge and let the copper hold for as long as it was going to hold, which was exactly as long as it needed to.